At that time, he was in such a mood, expressing that he no longer wanted to paint violent paintings. He felt exhausted by them, having been so deeply involved in creating so many over the years. He said, "I'm 94 years old." Clint Eastwood finally spoke out, lifting the veil of secrecy that had shrouded Gene Hackman for over 50 years, the friend, the rival, and the most haunting ghost in his life. Every word Clint spoke cut through memories like a blunt knife, dragging out broken phone calls, unspoken words, almost like backstage punches exchanged after Unforgiven. And because of certain secrets about Gene Hackman, Clint made it clear that if they weren't revealed, he'd take them to the grave. What is that truth? If you want to know, leave a comment with the number 1. This is a story of friendship and the tragedy of cowboys who never learned how to bow their heads. Of Clint and Gene, 2 men destined to face each other through the barrel of a gun until the end of their lives. In January 2024, as winter covered Carmel by the sea in a blanket of snow, Clint Eastwood sat at an old wooden table by the window, his weathered fingers gripping the fountain pen that had been with him for decades. In front of him was a blank sheet of paper, still and silent, as though waiting for one final confession. Clint wasn't the type to offer apologies, much less explanations. But he wrote slowly, each stroke of the pen trembling, as if every word carried the weight of a long, heavy past. This letter was for Gene Hackman, the friend, the rival, the only person Clint Eastwood both wanted to avoid and yet desperately wished to see again in this world. "Gene, I guess we both thought we had more time. Turns out all we really have is Unforgiven." These brief, blunt words were as much a reflection of Clint himself, yet beneath the black ink lay a lifetime of highs and lows between 2 old cowboys, disagreements over every frame, long, silent phone calls, those glances that understood each other's breath without a word. Clint folded the letter and placed it in a worn brown envelope, but he never sent it. The letter stayed in an old wooden box in the corner of the room, alongside unwritten scripts, blurry behind-the-scenes photos, and untold memories of Gene Hackman. The box stood like a silent diary, a place where everything Clint had left unsaid was quietly buried. When his family found it after Gene Hackman and his wife passed away, the letter was still intact, unsealed, never having left that room. An unsent letter, but one that no longer mattered, for the recipient had understood long ago. Some friendships don't need a perfect ending. Some apologies don't need to be spoken, and some cowboys are meant to stand at opposite ends of the town, not moving forward, not turning away, just quietly waiting for each other as the sun sets. That evening, Clint sat on the porch, his eyes fixed on the fiery horizon. The shadows stretched longer, gradually enveloping his frail figure. An old gunslinger who had finally realized that all the grudges, stubbornness, and pride between him and Gene Hackman didn't truly matter. All that remained were the whispers of the wind carrying the sound of distant hooves, where the 2 old gunslingers would at last ride together on a road no longer divided. The letter stayed in the old box, a final secret between the 2 men, and Clint Eastwood, the last gunslinger, whispered into the darkness, "I'll see you again, Gene, when the storm settles." 2 old gunslingers, one fallen, one standing tall, left only with unsaid words, unsent letters, and rusted guns lying still beneath the dust of time. The news of Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa's passing on a quiet afternoon in Santa Fe spread through Hollywood like a cold breeze. There was no grand spectacle, no public outpouring, just as fitting as the quiet life he'd led in his final 20 years. But as the breeze faded, it left behind a deep emptiness, one that wasn't just felt in the history of cinema, but in the hearts of those who had shared the spotlight with Gene. Hollywood was struck by the sobering realization that a monument had quietly disappeared into the sunset. Tributes began to fall like a gentle rain, persistent but soft, from young faces who never met Gene to the seasoned veterans who had always viewed him as the gold standard of acting. Everyone shared heartfelt tributes for the tough yet incredibly talented cowboy. Morgan Freeman, who had stood alongside Gene in Unforgiven, posted a black-and-white photo from 1992 showing the three men, Clint, Gene, and Morgan, sitting together on a wooden porch, each holding a cigarette, gazing into the distance. Gene was the only one who could push Clint Eastwood's patience on set, but Clint was the one who could always make Gene laugh with a dry joke. They were like oil and water, unable to live without each other. But the most awaited tribute, of course, was Clint Eastwood's. Clint didn't write much. He sent only a single handwritten letter through his manager to The Hollywood Reporter. The letter was short, but every sentence seemed to capture half a century of highs and lows between the two cowboys. Gene Hackman and I were never close friends, at least not by Hollywood standards. We didn't text. We didn't send birthday invites. We argued more than we laughed. We were silent more than we spoke. But if anyone were to ask me, at the end of my gun, who I'd most want to see, the answer has always been Gene Hackman. Just 4 sentences, but they sent shockwaves through Hollywood. That statement, for the American film industry, felt like a legendary vow because if Clint Eastwood was the last remaining figure from the golden cowboy era, Gene Hackman was the only one brave enough to stand beside him. Unafraid, unyielding, neither enemy nor full ally, but the one person Clint believed deserved his final bullet. The story of Unforgiven is the one most often remembered. The brutal, grim Western where Clint and Gene first aimed their guns at each other, both on screen and off. The media has often recounted behind-the-scenes moments, like when Gene Hackman got upset after Clint changed a line on set, or when Clint quietly left a meeting after Gene made a comment that bruised his director's ego. But no matter what, they always found their way back to each other in the end. Old photos flood social media, showing Clint and Gene standing in the cold rain in Alberta, their dusty coats, eyes squinting against the wind. 2 men not smiling, not posing, just standing there as if nothing in the world mattered except the person beside them. Hollywood loves flashy stories, but the tale of Clint and Gene is one of rough edges. No perfect friendship, no nights of shared beers, just awkward handshakes after every argument, short handwritten letters filled with thousands of unsaid words. And maybe it's that imperfect bond that earned them more respect in Hollywood than any polished, flawless friendship. We don't have to like each other to know we need each other. Clint's words from 2004 suddenly went viral, spreading across film forums. Gene Hackman had passed, taking with him the untold secrets of his life, but Clint Eastwood remains, a lone gunslinger standing on the hilltop, staring down at the valley of the past. Now there's no one at the other end of the barrel to challenge Clint, to argue over every scene, or to quietly sit beside him after long days of shooting. No one understood Clint Eastwood quite like Gene Hackman did. Hollywood remembers Gene Hackman as a cinematic icon, but to Clint, Gene wasn't just a legend. He was the only one bold enough to call Clint a stubborn old man, and then burst into laughter, the only one daring enough to throw a script in Clint's face, pick it up, revise it, and say, "Make it right." And when night falls, amidst the dim yellow lights of a roadside bar, perhaps somewhere in the Hollywood sky, two cowboy ghosts are riding side by side down a dusty road, saying nothing, needing no words, just two old men finally riding together as they were meant to. In 2015, a handwritten letter with no return address, just 3 faint swaying letters in the top left corner, GH, arrived in the old wooden mailbox at Clint Eastwood's home in Carmel. Dina, his ex-wife, who still visited occasionally to care for the house when Clint was away, found it. She placed it on his desk next to a pile of dusty scripts, then silently left without saying a word. She knew that letter mattered more than any $1,000,000 script, for it came from Gene Hackman, the old friend who had lingered in Clint's thoughts long after they stopped standing together under the bright lights of the set. Inside the envelope was a yellowed piece of paper with shaky, slanted handwriting, yet still sharp in the way only a man with countless golden statues could manage. There were no greetings, no lengthy introductions. Gene went straight to the point, as he always did in life. One final journey. "Clint, it's just you and me. No Oscars, no press, no agents. Just us and a story only we can tell." Clint read that letter over and over until its edges were creased and yellowed with time. But he never replied. Not because he didn't want to, but because Clint understood that some journeys are meant to be dreamed, not lived. The bond between Clint Eastwood and Gene Hackman didn't begin on the set of Unforgiven. In fact, they first crossed paths in the 1970s, when Clint was trying to step out from the shadow of Dirty Harry, and Gene had just won an Oscar for The French Connection. Their brief encounter at a producer's party left no lasting mark. Clint stood quietly in the corner, swirling his whiskey glass, while Gene laughed loudly, the confident glow of a recent winner in his eyes. They were two opposite forces, one as quiet as a cold gun, the other as fiery as a matchstick burning bright. Then, in 1992, Unforgiven brought them together. No fanfare, no trumpets, just two old cowboys sharing one last cigarette before the sunset. Clint never forgot the look on Gene's face after the final scene, when William Money turned his back and walked away in the rain. Gene watched him, no acting, no words, just the genuine gaze of a man who knew his time was running out. From that look, an invisible thread tied them together. After Unforgiven, their meetings became infrequent. Meals were rare, calls spaced out over many years, but the handwritten letters never stopped. Gene didn't use email, and Clint wasn't fond of texting. Both believed only handwritten words held the weight of things they couldn't express out loud. In those letters, there were jokes about Hollywood's growing shallowness, memories of shooting in the cold, and confessions only made when alone at a writing desk. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like if we made one last movie?" Gene had written once. Clint read it, folded it, placed it in a drawer, and stepped outside to light a cigar. He didn't reply, not because there was no answer, but because the question itself was enough. They both knew the shadow of Unforgiven was too big, so big that anything they did afterward would only be a faint echo of it. But in 2015, Gene wrote again, without warning, without hesitation. This time, he sent a direct invitation. There's a story we haven't told, Clint. The story of two men who should have died long ago but somehow survived and continue to write. Tell it before it's too late. Clint held the letter in his hand for a long time. In his mind, the scenes started playing on their own. Two old cowboys, hunched backs, trembling hands, standing face to face on a dusty street, no guns, only words left unsaid. But Clint knew Gene wasn't just asking him to make a movie. He was inviting Clint on one final journey, a journey of two old souls who had weathered every storm a film could bring, but not the storm of friendship. In 2018, at a corner table in a small seaside bar in Carmel, California, Clint Eastwood sat across from his longtime agent, a thick stack of scripts in front of him. These weren't the usual Hollywood scripts he received each week. This was a special project, one proposed by a special person, Gene Hackman. It all began a few months earlier when Gene, who had nearly vanished from public life after his last film, Welcome to Mooseport in 2004, unexpectedly called Clint. Gene's voice was deeper now, the loud laughter and familiar sarcastic remarks gone, replaced by a slow deliberation, as if each word was carefully weighed before being spoken. Clint, I've got something. Maybe my last film. I don't know how much time I have left, but if there's one last film, I only want to make it with you. Clint stayed silent for a long time on the other end of the line. They say that when old gunslingers talk about their final stand, it means the guns are loaded, but no one knows where the bullet will land. That film was never officially announced. No title, no producer, not even a formal contract. Just the initial idea scribbled on a crumpled piece of paper. Two old cowboys, once comrades, now standing at opposite ends of a town, each holding a secret that cannot be revealed, a gunfight no one wants, but one they can't escape. Clint liked the idea, and Gene liked it too, but that was the last point they agreed on. The project dragged on through countless arguments. Clint wanted the film to be nostalgic, a peaceful goodbye to their golden era, while Gene envisioned it as cold and brutal, exposing the dark side of legends. No glory, just scars hidden beneath wrinkled skin. They argued through handwritten letters, then over the phone. The letters that had once brought them together now became sharp weapons. Gene accused Clint of being afraid to tarnish his own monument, while Clint mocked Gene for clinging to a fading light. Word by word, sentence by sentence, they drove each other further apart. The climax came in a private meeting between the two at the end of 2018 in Santa Fe. No assistants, no producers, just the two men who had once stood side by side, now facing each other in a dimly lit room. No one knew exactly what was said, but according to a hotel employee who overheard, it was Gene who stormed out first, kicking the door open so violently that a painting on the wall shook. Clint stayed behind, staring at the whiskey glass in front of him, never taking a sip. In 2021, at the height of the pandemic, when everything seemed frozen in time, Gene suddenly called Clint. It was their first call in over 2 years. No one knew who called first, but both understood this might be their last. They stayed silent for a long time after the initial greeting. Gene asked about Clint's health. Clint gave a short reply. They talked about the weather, gas prices, the old films they had both been a part of, but neither of them brought up the unfinished film from 2018. Suddenly, Gene paused, his voice soft as if speaking to himself. "Clint, do you remember the last scene of Unforgiven, when I stood there watching you ride off into the rain?" Clint stayed silent. Gene chuckled quietly. "I never said it, but I knew. I knew we'd never have another one." Clint wanted to say something, but his throat tightened. The call ended with a sigh from both sides. They didn't hang up immediately, leaving it there, listening to each other's breath, as if two old cowboys stood at opposite ends of a town, hands on their guns, but no one drawing. After that call, Clint told a close friend, "I don't think I'll talk to Gene again," and he was right. When the news of Gene's passing spread in 2023, Clint made no public statement, posted no tribute. He simply retreated to his ranch, opening an old drawer where he kept all the letters Gene had sent, from the youthful ones to the final trembling words. Clint read through them all, each word, each punctuation mark, as if searching for any secret Gene had left unsaid. He found no secrets, only empty spaces, unfinished sentences, words crossed out, letters never sent. The greatest secret of Gene Hackman wasn't in those lines, but in the long silence between them, a bullet that had slipped between two old friends, never falling. And Clint understood that a part of his soul had gone with Gene down that dusty road long ago. When the news of Gene Hackman and his wife, Betsy Arakawa's death was discovered in their small home in Santa Fe, it didn't shock Clint Eastwood. At 94, Clint understood that quiet departures in the night were no longer unusual. What left him motionless by the window of his Carmel ranch that morning wasn't the news of Gene's passing, but the realization that the final words that should have been said would now never be spoken. The press quickly surrounded him, desperate for a statement from Clint. For the past 2 years, Clint and Gene had been estranged, avoiding each other entirely, with not a single word exchanged since their last phone call in 2021, when silence spoke louder than any words. The distance between them had grown too vast to bridge. But that day, Clint shattered the silence, not through a statement from his agent or a cold press release, but by standing in front of a local newspaper's camera. His voice cracked with age and the weight of years spent in isolation. "There was no actor greater than Gene Hackman, and there was no friend more important to me than him." Just 2 simple sentences, no flair, no exaggeration. Yet, for those who had followed the journey of these 2 legendary figures, it was clear that Clint Eastwood had never spoken those words about anyone. Not about Sergio Leone, Lee Van Cleef, or even his first wife. Only Gene Hackman. The reporters thought that was the end of it, but Clint wasn't done. After that brief statement, he returned to his farm, shut the door, and cut off all communication. The landline, the cell phone, the old fax machine, everything fell silent, like a desert after a gunfight. The only call made was to Kyle Eastwood, Clint's eldest son, who understood the complex, deep bond between his father and Gene Hackman better than anyone. Kyle later shared with a close friend that his father's voice that day sounded different, softer, burdened. The voice of the man with no name was gone, replaced by an old man finally acknowledging he had lost the battle with himself. "We wasted too much time being stubborn old men. Just those few words with no elaboration, no excuses. But in those words, there was all the regret, humility, and emotion Clint had kept buried for so long. Gene Hackman wasn't just a co-star or a partner in on-screen confrontations. He was the only one who truly reflected the rough, flawed, and vulnerable side of Clint Eastwood, the part hidden beneath his tough cowboy exterior. And Clint knew that Gene Hackman was also the only person who ever dared to face himself in that same mirror. The two stubborn old men, as Clint called them, had spent nearly 50 years doing everything but admitting just how much they needed one another. They exchanged letters, stories, and unfinished dreams. They argued, hung up on each other, and spent hours in absurd drinking binges. But they never said that when the end came, the hardest part wasn't losing a friend, but realizing they had pushed that friend too far away, past the point of no return. And when the dust finally settled, Clint sat alone on the porch, gazing at the Pacific Ocean. No cigarette, no whiskey, just the wind howling through the old wooden planks. Those close to Clint know he's not the type to cry easily. But on that day, Kyle said his eyes were red, tears that never fell, but quietly wore away the sharp edges of an old cowboy's soul. Clint had survived countless on-screen gunfights, but his final battle with his own stubbornness was the hardest loss. The press kept speculating, wondering if there was a joint will between Clint and Gene, a secret pact about the unfinished movie from 2018, or a final letter Clint never sent. No one knows except Clint, and he'll never reveal it. Do you know about that letter? If so, leave comment number 2. If not, leave number 5. The world saw only an old, frail man sitting quietly at the dinner table, toying with an old lighter, a birthday gift from Gene in 1985 after Pale Rider was released, engraved with just 2 words: compadre. Not friend, not brother, just compadre, a companion, a gunslinger who'd stand by your side but was also ready to draw when needed. As the sun set over the Carmel Ranch, Clint's shadow stretched across the wooden floor, merging with the sound of waves crashing. Life continued as it always had, but somewhere in that fading light, maybe Gene Hackman still stood there watching his old friend, just like in the days when they stood on opposite ends of town. No words spoken, no shots fired, just 2 old souls finally learning to let go. Clint Eastwood sat silently, lost in thought by the living room window, his weathered hand gently resting on the worn wooden armrest. The sunset cast long shadows through the glass, washing a pale hue over the old photographs on the wall. At 94, each passing day felt like a fragile sheet of paper, ready to be torn apart by the winds of memory. But today, the wind carried not the scent of gunpowder from the Wild West or the rustle of a new script. Instead, it carried the weight of unspoken truths, memories long buried, and a quiet reflection on a lifetime spent facing the ghosts of the past. Today, there was only silence, and this silence was named Gene Hackman. Clint Eastwood had lived with silence like an old, stern friend. Those who knew him understood that Clint wasn't one to dwell on the past or cling to old glories. But this silence was different from anything he had ever known. It was heavy, like the click of a gun with no bullets left, like the final step on barren land. For the man who had passed was Little Bill Daggett, the ghost of a friend and rival, a shadow that would linger long after the credits rolled. Clint and Gene weren't the type to call each other daily or hang out on weekends. They were from an older generation of friends, men who communicated through looks, nods, and quick words between takes. Unforgiven wasn't just an Oscar-winning film. It was a bond that tied the two Western hearts together. Over the years, many Hollywood colleagues have become rivals, but Clint and Gene never let awards or the spotlight eclipse the respect they held for one another. When Unforgiven came out in 1992, Clint was 62, and Gene was also 62. The two seasoned men emerged from the shadows of a golden era to tell their story. That of the old heroes, survivors of countless battles and too many stray bullets. "Killing a man is a hard thing," William Money's line echoed like a death knell, haunting those who had worn the cowboy hat for real. From that moment, Clint and Gene knew their bond had deepened, unbreakable. But time is merciless to all. In the years that followed, Clint kept pushing forward in filmmaking, while Gene slipped away without fanfare. No retirement party, no emotional speech. Gene Hackman, the relentless cop Popeye Doyle, the man who once shook America to its core, vanished from Hollywood as if he'd never been there. Clint called a few times, then stopped. He understood that sometimes old cowboys choose to quietly disappear into the darkness, like the last bullet hitting the ground. Every time Gene's name came up, Clint's expression turned somber. "He was one of the best," he'd say, then lapse into silence. No one knew what had been said between them after their last meeting. All anyone noticed was that whenever Unforgiven was mentioned, Clint would retreat to his private room, sit beside his old guitar, and gently strum a few notes. Once, when asked if he kept in touch with Gene, Clint just smiled and said, "We had our time." But what was the truth? No one knew. Clint wasn't one to open up easily, and Gene was even less so. Both carried the weight of lost cowboys in a digital world. They were icons of a time when men settled matters with guns and silence. But Gene's departure, with all its oddity and mystery, pushed Clint to break his rule of never sharing. Thank you for watching this video. Please like and subscribe to support our channel. See you in the next one.